ready for some serious Cold War intrigue. Today we're diving deep into the Cuban Revolution.
Ooh, yeah.
And how a major CIA blunder turned Fidel Castro into, like, a communist icon.
It's wild how much the U.S. relied on repeating what they thought was a win in Guatemala.
Right, like they tried to just copy and paste their strategy.
Exactly.
Completely underestimating Castro and the Cuban people.
Completely.
But it all begins, get this, with Fidel Castro just strolling into Washington, D.C. in 1959. And our sources paint this, well, kind of absurd picture of him being welcomed as some hero of democracy.
It's almost unbelievable, right?
I know. Newspapers calling him a shield against communism.
Wow.
Even Dean Acheson, he was like the most democratic leader in Latin America. You can't make this up.
It really makes you question the whole narrative at the time.
Totally. Get this, even the Cuban exiles in Miami, at first, they were on board with Castro.
I know. It's wild to think about how quickly things changed.
They totally did.
Yeah.
So Castro's offered aid, a chance to play ball with the U.S., and his response.
Let me guess.
Ninguna. Nothing. What a boss move.
Total power move. It was a huge rejection of U.S. influence. Like, I'm nobody's puppet.
Exactly. And this is where, the ghost of Guatemala really enters the picture. Because just a few years earlier, the CIA had their success in Guatemala, right?
Yeah.
They managed to, well, topple the democratically elected government without a full-blown invasion.
They did.
So naturally, they thought they could pull off the same thing in Cuba.
Makes sense in their minds.
But here's the thing. Cuba wasn't Guatemala.
And Castro.
And Castro, despite first saying he wasn't a communist, he wasn't stupid. He saw what happened in Guatemala. And he had Che Guevara by his side.
And Guevara had seen it all firsthand.
He was there for the U.S.-backed coup. Deeply suspicious of their motives,
Rightfully so.
So when the U.S. tries to pull a Guatemala with the Bay of Pigs invasion,
oh boy,
it backfires. Big time.
Spectacularly is more like it.
It was a total disaster for the U.S.
No.
They totally misread the situation.
They misjudged Castro's support, overestimated their own intel, and completely misread the Cuban people.
And that's what really pushes Castro towards the Soviet Union and cements Guevara as a revolutionary icon.
Totally. The Bay of Pigs was a turning point.
He was.
Before that, Castro was being cautious, keeping his options open. But after, boom, he fully embraced communism, aligned with the Soviet Union.
Like they pushed him right into their arms.
Exactly. It's almost comical. They created the very thing they were trying to prevent.
Talk about unintended consequences. And what about the misinformation? They were at it again, right? Like in Guatemala.
Of course. The CIA was using radio broadcasts, especially Radio America.
To spread what?
Rumors. Lies, really. They even fabricated a story about Castro sending Cuban children to the Soviet Union.
No way.
Yes way. And it worked.
Parents were terrified, sending their kids away alone through Operation Pedro Pan.
Heartbreaking, isn't it? Just shows how easily people can be manipulated with fear and propaganda.
This is insane. So they create this lie, scare families into sending their kids away, and then they use that very operation as proof of Castro's cruelty.
Exactly.
Classic.
A classic case of misinformation.
And Guevara, who'd seen this all before in Guatemala, it's like, he's saying not this time. His warning about Cuba becoming another Guatemala.
What does it become?
A rallying cry, a symbol of defiance.
Right.
And with him standing next to Castro throughout this chaos,
what happens?
It just solidifies his image as a true revolutionary hero.
It's a symbol of Latin American resistance.
That's incredible. While the U.S. was congratulating themselves on toppling Arbenz in Guatemala, they were setting the stage for something way bigger. They turned the Cuban Revolution into a powerful symbol of communism right on their doorstep.
It's truly remarkable. They created the very monster they were afraid of.
It's like they lit the fuse on their own powder keg.
A perfect analogy. And, the U.S. response to this communist threat in Cuba totally played into Castro's hands.
How so?
The Bay of Pigs fiasco, plus the constant U.S. hostility, pushed Castro even closer to the Soviets.
Like they were dead set on making him the ultimate communist villain.
Exactly. Speaking of which, remember those Soviet missiles?
Oh, this is where things get really tense.
Know it. After the Bay of Pigs debacle, Castro lets the Soviets put nuclear missiles on Cuban soil.
Hold on. So the U.S. tries to overthrow him, fails spectacularly.
Yep.
And his response is to invite their biggest rival to set up shop right next door.
Pretty much.
You can't make this stuff up.
Oh, but it gets even wilder.
Wilder. How?
When the U.S. found out about the missiles, some top brass, like General Curtis LeMay, wanted to launch a full-on nuclear attack on Cuba.
Are you serious? Talk about an overreaction. Thank goodness they didn't go through with it.
Right. World came close to ending because of a few missiles.
It's crazy how these events in Cuba, which started with the U.S. trying to control who was in charge, escalated into a global crisis.
And it kind of sums up what was going on across Latin America then.
How so?
The U.S. was so convinced they had to control the region, to protect their interests, that they poured money and resources into Latin American militaries.
So it wasn't just about fighting communism.
Nope. They were literally propping up these military regimes.
Even if it meant undermining democracy.
Often, yeah. Our sources say by the 1970s, the U.S. was providing over 50% of Latin American military budgets.
50%? That's insane!
It's mind-blowing. They were the biggest arms dealer, and guess who was their biggest customer?
Latin America.
Bingo!
But why? What were they hoping to achieve by basically militarizing the entire region?
Control, plain and simple. They saw these militaries as a way to keep things stable.
Stable in a way that benefited the U.S., of course.
Of course. It's like, we're here to help, as long as you do things our way.
Right. And did it work? Did this help actually create stable democracies?
You already know the answer.
It backfired.
Spectacularly. Instead of stability and democracy, they got
dictatorships.
Bingo. U.S. intervention often had the opposite effect. Undermined democracy, fueled corruption, you name it.
Makes sense. When you give a bunch of generals a blank check and tell them to silence any opposition,
what happened?
Things tend to get a little dictatorial.
A little. And this is where that infamous School of the Americas comes in.
Oh, yeah. Heard of that.
The U.S. trained thousands of Latin American military officers there.
In what exactly?
Counterinsurgency tactics, mostly, which were often used against their own people later.
So basically a training ground for future dictators.
Essentially, yes. The focus was fighting communism above all else.
Right.
And that meant any opposition, even calls for reform, were seen as potential communist threats.
Talk about short-sighted.
It was a recipe for disaster. The U.S., trying to contain communism, ended up creating the very conditions that fueled instability and repression.
Wow. Talk about irony.
It's tragic, really. Countless lives lost, countless people imprisoned, all in the name of fighting an ideology that the U.S. often misunderstood.
It's a stark reminder that good intentions, without understanding and humility, can have disastrous consequences.
Couldn't agree more. And let's not forget, this wasn't just some abstract geopolitical game. Real people's lives were at stake.
Speaking of real people, our sources mention this fascinating guy, William Morgan, an American who fought for Castro.
Wait, what?
But then ended up working for the CIA trying to overthrow him.
No way.
Totally true.
The Comandante Yankee, right?
That's him. Talk about a story full of twists and turns.
It really highlights how messy things were.
Total moral complexities. He goes from being a celebrated revolutionary to a CIA asset.
It ends up executed by firing squad in Cuba. Talk about a life story.
It's like something out of a movie. But you know what I find most interesting about his story?
What's that?
It shows how blurry the lines were back then.
Totally. And it makes you think about all the misinformation and propaganda flying around during that whole era.
The CIA wasn't just, toppling governments.
Right.
They were waging a full-on information war.
They were masters at shaping the narrative,
It makes you question everything we think we know about this period. How much of it is just Cold War propaganda?
Right. It's a great question. History is written by the victors, after all, and in the Cold War.
The U.S. definitely controlled the narrative.
For sure.
So we've got the U.S. meddling in Latin American affairs, propping up dictators, spreading propaganda.
Right.
But there's also this powerful resistance movement building.
Absolutely, with figures like Che Guevara leading the charge.
People who saw right through the U.S.'s facade.
They refused to be pawns in their Cold War games.
And these weren't just like random uprisings. These movements were driven by real grievances.
Totally. We're talking poverty, inequality, exploitation.
It's like the U.S. was so obsessed with communism that they missed the bigger picture. Or maybe they just found it more convenient to ignore it.
It's a classic case of treating the symptoms, not the disease. And U.S. intervention often made things worse. By propping up dictators and silencing anyone who disagreed, they just created a breeding ground for more revolutions.
So it's this vicious cycle. They create the very monsters they're supposedly fighting.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Cuba or Guatemala. It's the same story all over Latin America, Chile, Argentina, Nicaragua, you name it.
Always siding with whoever served their interests, even if it meant propping up a dictator.
Exactly. Over and over again, they chose power over the will of the people.
It's easy to judge with hindsight, you know? Wow, they really messed that up. But it's scary how much of this still impacts U.S.-Latin American relations.
Totally. That legacy of intervention, it left a huge scar.
A scar that hasn't quite healed.
Nope. And if we want any hope of a better relationship between the U.S. and Latin America, we need to acknowledge it.
I have to own up to it.
Exactly, because that whole good neighbor policy.
What about it?
More like the nosy neighbor who tries to control everything and then wonders why no one likes them.
And Guevara's prediction. Cuba will not be another Guatemala.
What about it?
It came true. Castro stayed in power for decades, no matter what the U.S. tried.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is. It shows the power of resistance, you know. You can't just force your will on people.
Especially not a whole country.
Even the most powerful nation can't control everything.
Nope. They learned that the hard way.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners today?
Think critically. Don't just believe everything you hear, especially about history.
Do your own digging.
Exactly. Question everything. Look for the motivations, the evidence. Don't be afraid to challenge what you think you know.
Because, as we've seen today, things aren't always as simple as they seem. The good guys aren't always so good, and the bad guys
Are more complicated.
way more complicated. The only way to really get it is to look deeper, see the bigger picture.
Love that. History is rarely black and white. It's our job to figure out all those shades of gray.
Well said. So here's something to think about. How much has really changed since the Cold War? Do we see any of that good neighbor attitude in U.S. foreign policy today? And if so, what can we learn from the past to build a better future? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.